Thanks. I have to say thanks to Melissa for reaching out and inviting me to come down. It's exciting to be here. And Mike for kind of putting together the logistics. I work for a nonprofit land trust in Lincoln, Massachusetts. We're focused on Henry David Thoreau and kind of preserving his landscape, the landscape that inspired him, and his literature and legacy and all that, which has nothing to do with vernal pools at all. I spent 10 years as a vernal pool ecologist and biologist for the state of Massachusetts, Division of Fisheries and Wildlife, and have done an awful lot of work with through that, and then also with a group that I co-founded, the Vernal Pool Association, so that's kind of where my creds come from, if we need to know. Most of the photos that I will show today are coming from the Vernal Pool Association. My colleague Leo Kenny has spent decades taking photographs of organisms of vernal pools, and some pretty dramatic and fantastic stuff. It's fun to look at, so just be aware that the Vernal Pool Association is out there, vernalpool.org, and you can get all the information you need, and we're pretty generous with getting photographs out there and so forth, so if you ever have the need. Vernal pools, I'll speak very generally. We think of them as small forest ponds that are temporary in nature. That's a good generalization, but like all generalizations, it's not entirely true. Around here, and I'll admit that yesterday was the first day I ever stepped foot on Long Island. So you can wonder about my credibility, but as it turns out, this morning's discussion about geology was a great primer for my talk, because the vast majority of vernal pools are glacial relics. They were created by the glaciers, and so actually having that explanation and primer is a nice way to approach this. In New England and New York, generally, the glaciated Northeast, vernal pools will tend to fill in the fall, hold water through the winter. We like to go looking for little skating ponds in the woods to see where we might visit in the spring. Come springtime, they are usually at their fullest. In dry years like this year, sometimes they are pretty dry or dry entirely to get going, but usually they're at their fullest in early spring, and they really spring to life. We call them vernal pools, pools of the spring, not because they fill in the spring, but because they really explode and become wonderful places to visit and check out. Many, certainly not all, vernal pools will dry out come mid to late summer. And so what this does is it establishes an aquatic ecosystem that is entirely unsuitable to support fish. And as a result, an awful lot of organisms have evolved life history strategies that require a lengthy period of water. We like to think of vernal pools as holding water at least 2 months, starting in the spring of most years. But because they dry out, they're free of fish, and these organisms have adapted to this condition. So this is sort of the bald eagle of vernal pools. The spotted salamander, also known as the yellow spotted salamander for some reason, is a fairly common organism, and they are adapted entirely to vernal pools. They don't breed successfully in other kinds of wetlands. So we think of them as vernal pool obligate species. If we find breeding spotted salamanders, we know we're looking at a vernal pool. They have some close relatives, the blue spotted salamander, the Jefferson salamander, and these two species are so closely related that they commingle and their genetics are all wonky, and the speciation is all over the place and is not even worth trying to think about. But all these guys are here on Long Island. The marbled salamander, which is a great salamander, they actually, instead of breeding in the springtime, they actually breed in the fall. I'll mention that with a little more detail. And then, ruthlessly stolen from the internet, I don't know who John White is, I apologize if he's here, tiger salamanders. which I've seen only the egg masses of, but these are a really neat salamander, and Long Island is as far north as they go, so we don't get them up in our neck of the woods. All of these are imbistomatid salamanders in the family Imbistomatidae, and they are all vernal pool dependent creatures. We have a frog in this area, the wood frog, and that is a vernal pool dependent frog. And then there are a whole host of invertebrates that are adapted to this environment. You know, they need water for a while, but they like it to dry out. What I'm showing here is a fairy shrimp. They get to be about an inch, inch and a half long. They're beautiful to look at. They are ephemeral. They can only survive in vernal pools that dry out. The females produce drought-resistant eggs, encysted eggs, and they actually have to dry and probably have to freeze. And then when the water comes back, that triggers the hatching, and they go through their life cycle, they breed, and then they die off. So they are entirely adapted to vernal pools, and there are a lot of organisms that are like that, none quite as showy and obvious. So I'll just give you a sense, and again, the caveat that I don't really know what vernal pools look like down here on Long Island, but I'm assuming they look fairly similar to a lot of the natural vernal pools that we get up there in New England. This is what I think of as the archetype. Small, forested, springtime it's full, midsummer it's dry. You can actually see a person right there for scale. They're little, sometimes, unless they're big. Vernal pools can actually be quite large. As they get bigger, generally the water stays longer, and as the water stays longer, the plants change. This is a vernal pool that we see buttonbush all through the middle of it, and that's pretty common. This could be waist deep, it could be chest deep, you know, and at its fullest, and then will most likely dry out entirely come late summer. Sometimes they hold water almost year round. And we have many examples of vernal pools that are actually permanent except for once or twice, you know, like every decade or so they'll dry out and kill off any fish that were dumped in by the kids to go fishing or whatever. But that will maintain the vernal pool-ness of that basin. When we have pools that hold water for long periods of time, they tend to really fill in with all sorts of interesting vegetation and all sorts of wildlife and stuff that I'll show you. Because of the very regular pattern of filling and drying, different plants sort of set up shop in different zones. And this is a little bit uncommon to see so clearly, but this is a beautiful shot that shows the zonation of plants that can develop in vernal pools. And in fact, this is a botanical pattern that shows up very commonly in vernal pools in California, which is actually where that term comes from. We kind of stole it on the East Coast. But at any rate, that's a really neat thing. Now, vernal pools don't have to be of the forest, as I mentioned. And where we have a freshwater lens on the backside of dunes, we quite often see vernal pools pop up. It's not going to have salamanders, wood frogs. You know, they can't live in the sand, but it'll have other organisms that are indicators of vernal pools. So it's the same habitat, just the details are a little different. Pit and mound topography, extensive red maple swamps. Quite often, the pits will hold water through like sort of late into summertime, and the salamanders and frogs will find those, will sort of know where they are, and they'll lay their eggs there, and those will be nice little vernal pools scattered within a sort of more complex wetland matrix. The backwaters of rivers, oxbows and things, as they get separated from the main stem, quite often function as vernal pools. And then vernal pools aren't all natural. We certainly are pretty good at changing hydrology on the landscape. And this is a 1930s CCC project close to where I live. It's nice. It's a little spot pond brook, and it's dammed up, and they created a backwater and a wall that I can walk on and look at salamanders and stuff. But fish don't get in here. It holds water for a couple months. And the salamanders said, sure, all right, works. And it's a really great place to take people to go see salamanders in the springtime. Now, one thing to sort of be clear about, and there's often confusion, over is the idea that these things are temporary, like on a spatial scale. The basins that were created by the glaciers, those kettle hole depressions that often function as vernal pools, those are pretty static. Those aren't going anywhere. And on an annual basis, they may fill up really full one year, and they may not fill very much at all, and then we can be pretty sure the water will go away. But that basin that functions as vernal pool habitat is going to be there for a long period of time. This is the vernal pool that is just a couple of paces past where Henry built his house at Walden Pond. And I go there every spring and I look at the salamanders and frogs and stuff. So that, from a sort of, that pool itself is very stable and is going to be there year after year. And I killed it. Whew. Fixed it. They have a murder button on this one too. So the spotted salamander is just a great critter. How can you not love a spotted salamander? They grow to be 6 or 7 inches long. They're chubby. They're kind of rubbery looking. They're just beautiful. They're neat to look at. And so let's learn about spotted salamanders. So vernal pools dry out, as I think I mentioned. And so that sets up a situation where these animals that are adapted to them are in a race against drying. Right? These things, essentially they know that these pools are going to dry out. So the evolutionary pressure has been to be able to start your breeding as early as possible. Oftentimes, the animals that use vernal pools will come to their vernal pool when there's still snow on the ground and ice on the surface of the water. You know, when we get to 40 degrees and it's rainy and miserable at night, we say, time to go out and look for salamanders. This is what they're going to quite often. In fact, tonight should be decent weather for salamanders. So it's pretty cool. You know, you got this exotherm that is little, and they are terrestrial. They're walking from somewhere out in the woods down to a vernal pool, 1,000, 1,500 feet away, whatever it may be. And yet they're going when it's freezing cold out. And we've done a very good job of crisscrossing our world with pavement, and so this, you know, they most often have to cross roads to get to where they're going. And this is where most people will encounter a spotted salamander for the first time in their life, and if they're paying attention, they won't run it over. But an awful lot of salamanders and frogs do get whacked on the roads in the early spring. They breed, because of that pressure to go early, they breed explosively. And so in an area where there's a healthy population of spotted salamanders, they're all coming together at one time. And they do this ritualized mating dance, which we call congressing. It is just fantastic. It is one of the natural phenomena that I think everybody should witness in life. And that talk this morning about fish, we realized we have to start embedding video. That was pretty cool. This would be a neat thing to put on video. The salamanders are laying, the male salamanders are laying little packets of sperm on the pool floor. The females choose which one they want and pick it up in their cloaca. We get internal fertilization without any real physical contact. And then a couple days later, the females deposit eggs. And so you can see this one putting out her eggs right there. They attach them to vegetation to keep them at the right level, because the water is going to go away a little bit. And then, you know, over time, in a particular pool, the salamanders will figure out where the best spots are, and so the frog and salamanders tend to lay communally within their vernal pool. The eggs take a couple of months to get through their larval development. During that time, they turn green. There's a symbiotic alga that is actually present in the reproductive organs of the females. They carry it, and so it inoculates the eggs as they're deposited. And that alga consumes nitrogenous waste from the growing embryo. It creates oxygen to feed the growing embryos. It's really pretty wild. And after a couple of months, they pop out and they become these free-living salamander larvae. They are almost unmistakable at the very beginning. They have 4 legs. They've got a nice wide head and big brushy gills on the sides of the heads. kind of can't confuse them for anything else in a vernal pool if you happen to net these up. And then they'll spend another month and a half, 2 months growing until it becomes time to metamorphose. The tail changes, they become lung breathers, all sorts of magic happens, and then they go off and hike off into the woods. Those that survive, there's an awful lot of, mortality. But these guys take, all summer to get to this point. This usually happens late August, early September, October, around Massachusetts. Timing's a little different down here, I'm sure. They go off into the woods. They become terrestrial. These guys will live 10 to 15 years in the wild. And they'll reproduce most years, so they've got a nice long time to be salamanders. And they will go back to their natal pool. That's when we deal with conservation issues, quite often it's, well, can we fill that one and we'll make you one over here? The issue is that these salamanders know where the good vernal pool is, the one that works. And so they go back to it. And so 90% or so of the population breeding in an area will always go back to the same vernal pool. And if we pave that vernal pool over, they'll go back to it if they still are alive. And they'll say, I guess it's dry this year, I'll come back next year. And they go away and then come back to it. And I guess it's dry this year, I'll come back next year. Ad nauseum until they don't do that anymore. So that's a real issue with the conservation of vernal pools. And we always hear the quip, why should I care about frogs? What does it matter? In places where we have good, healthy populations of salamanders and frogs and bugs and all that stuff, we tend to have much less problem with the other bugs that we really don't like to encounter. Salamander, there's an awful lot of predation going on in vernal pools. And when we have lots of salamanders eating lots of stuff, the mosquito larvae tend to be eaten up pretty quickly. So that's why vernal pools are important, okay? Within the spotted salamanders, neat stuff. I'll just kind of blast through this a little bit. The spot patterns are highly variable. Sometimes we get spotless spotted salamanders, like the female on the bottom here. They are, they're fingerprints, really. I had, someone sent me a pair of photographs last year. A salamander in 2005 who came to a breeding site, and then the same salamander in 2015 who came back to that pool, and we could tell it exactly because of the fingerprint of the spot pattern. Pretty cool. They're not always normally colored. This is a leucistic larva that Leo Kenny caught and photographed. Pretty wild. Probably wouldn't last very long in the wild, frankly. Hit me, eat me. But at any rate, this is wild. Just from a biological standpoint. So this salamander was in captivity being photographed, and in early July, some bug got it, bit its arm off. By mid-July, there's a limb bud showing up, and by late July, done, all set, we're good to go. There's a lot of biology there that's being studied. Are there human applications that are there things that we could learn here? Just a lot of neat stuff going on with vernal pools. This is an example of bad photographer, bad biologist. I was out late one night at a vernal pool during congressing time, found this salamander. It was pretty. I spent a lot of time shooting it in all different angles and so forth. It wasn't until I got home and was looking at the photos on the computer that I said, that's weird. He's got a bifurcated front leg. So there are these parasites that this is their specialty. They lay a cyst at the limb bud where it's rapid cell division, and it causes these wonky sort of multiple limb organisms to come out. And what that does is it reduces their ability to get away from the next predator that's important in the parasite's life cycle. And so this probably was affected by one of those, but not terribly affected. If I had realized it in the field, I would have taken them home and gotten a lot more photos, but at any rate. I mentioned the marbled salamander is a little different. They breed in the fall. They go down to a dry vernal pool, they lay their eggs, and they wait for the water to come. The female will stay with the nest for a period of time and defend it from ants and other predators. And hopefully the water comes, they hatch out, and they spend the winter as little larvae. They are on Long Island, so it's possible that if we find a vernal pool that's been holding water through the winter and we do a little dip netting, we might find some larvae at this time of year, and they'd be nice big larvae. We can tell marbled salamander very quickly from everybody else because they've got a melanistic chin. They've got speckles, different amounts of color on their chins, and it's a dead giveaway. You flip one over, and there you go. Blast through the frogs a little bit. Wood frogs are neat, and they're pretty, and they got a wonderful call, and we know that spring has arrived when we hear the ducks out back. And actually, it's the wood frogs that sound an awful lot like ducks. They go through a similar thing. They breed explosively in the early spring. The eggs last like about 3 weeks, typically. They'll turn green. They hatch out, turn into little froglets, and do their little froglet thing. And sometimes they don't make it. And this is the trade-off, right? They're going early. They're using vernal pools. They're using aquatic systems that they know are going to dry out to avoid fish predation. But sometimes they fail. And sometimes they fail catastrophically. These guys just didn't get far enough along in development to get to that magic point where they can begin the metamorphosis process. Sometimes when the water's disappearing quickly, they can, if they've hit that magic mark, they can speed up their metamorphosis, and they come out as tiny, tiny little things. But if they don't get to that point, they just croak. And and that's just kind of the trade-off. And this is the, you know, I flipped over some of these logs and found that previous picture, and these rocks were just covered in bird dew. So, you know, they continue to do their job of feeding stuff, and that's really sort of what their job is in a lot of respects. If they make it through, they turn into a beautiful little frog and go off into the woods and live for a year or so, and maybe get eaten. This is amazing. We've been learning, in the last few years, we've been learning a lot more about barred owls. And they spend an awful lot of time at vernal pools, apparently, and will hunt salamanders and frogs. And this came across my Facebook feed a little while ago, and I said, wow, that's neat. And I got in touch with Larry and asked if I could use his photograph, and he was happy to have it done. But he spent an awful lot of time to get this one frame. But there it is. I mean, that's just what vernal pools are about. They feed stuff. And all sorts of things come to vernal pools to eat. You know, vernal pools are detrital systems. The energy starts with leaf litter, and it turns into frogs and salamanders and other things. And those frogs and salamanders turn into birds and snakes and turtles and other stuff that is equally fun to look at. But vernal pools are a place where lots of things get eaten. Vernal pools are attractive to most amphibians in our area. Gray tree frogs, my favorite frog. It's just the best. If you ever get a chance to play with a gray tree frog, dangle it off your thumb. It's just fun. This is Hyla versicolor, and they're called Hyla versicolor for a reason. This is the same frog, about 20 minutes apart. They will go from ashen white to chocolate brown to emerald green if their background is correct. Just neat. When gray tree frogs are in the larval state, if there's a lot of predation, if there's a lot of sort of predatory pressure, their tail fin will turn crimson red. We think as something to hit that won't have a big damaging result on the tadpole itself, but it's quite neat. But it's reactive to the amount of predation that they're experiencing. Like I say, vernal pools are attractive to just about all of our amphibians. Bullfrogs, green frogs, the spotted frogs that I always confuse. I don't expect you to be able to distinguish between the pickerel and the leopard frog. But these will all come to vernal pools. Sometimes, if the conditions are right, they'll breed there. If the conditions aren't quite so right, they'll just feed there. There's all sorts of different reasons that these animals come to vernal pools. Spadefoot toads are a neat creature. They are present here on Long Island and then up onto Cape Cod and a little bit into southern Massachusetts. They have this specialized digging spade on the back of their feet, and they sort of wiggle themselves down into the soil and spend sometimes years underground waiting for the right conditions to arrive. Big heavy thunderstorms in the middle of summer that just bring torrential rain, that will bring the spadefoot toads out. They breed explosively. Their larvae, their eggs hatch in days. Their larvae metamorphose in a week or two. It's very, very fast, and they're using these rain puddle, really nothing more than rain puddle pools. And quite often, we see these out on the coastal strand primarily. So vernal pools, are very sort of well known for the amphibians that come there, and there's lots of neat natural history stories to learn about in the amphibians. But there's the diversity of invertebrates is just remarkable, and I'll just kind of blast through some things. But like I mentioned, they are detrital systems, and the fundamental base of the energy chain for vernal pools starts with leaves that fall into the pool and begin to decompose. It's the bacteria and fungi that do the real work of decomposition, but there's an awful lot of organisms that sort of make big leaves into littler and littler pieces to get colonized, and that's what isopods are very important for. And these are extremely common in all kinds of wetlands, but they are very important bugs in vernal pools. This is Dugesia, a flatworm, bright green, neat. That's all, neat. When we're dip netting for stuff and we dump things into a bucket and start looking, quite often they get disturbed, they roll up into a teeny tiny little green blob, and if you're just looking through stuff, you'll go right by it. Set that glop on a shelf for a day or two and start watching what begins to move around, and the world opens up. There's a lot of neat stuff. We saw some of these earlier this morning, but in a marine setting. Copepods, Daphnia, ostracods, all sorts of wee beasties, Leo likes to call them. These are things that are being eaten by all sorts of stuff. They're very important in the sort of processing of energy in vernal pool systems. These are just neat. These are clam shrimps. We have, in Massachusetts at least, we have a few different species of clam shrimp. Two of them are state listed. This, I think, is the American clam shrimp. It's known from a handful of locations. The Agassiz clam shrimp is known from about 6 locations in the world. Just uncommon creatures, but neat. They're just like fairy shrimp. They have that same life cycle. They create drought-resistant eggs. They drop them on the pool floor. It has to dry out. When the water comes back, something happens, and they hatch, and they go through their little life cycle and then die. Why? I don't know. How did they get there? I don't know. Interesting stuff to learn about. Mites, teeny tiny little things. They have very complex life cycles. They're parasitic for a period of the life cycle, and then they go on to free living, and just weird and neat. We have all sorts of cnidarians. So this is a hydra, absolutely tiny little green hydra. That again, when you're scooping around and finding stuff, they just turn into little smudges. But you leave them be for a couple of days, and wow, they do their little hydra thing, and I was out collecting, just looking for salamanders one August, few years back, and I walked by a buttonbush stem that happened to be underwater, and buttonbush quite often gets all mossy on the stems, but it looked weird, it looked different, so I snapped a little piece off and brought it back to the lab, and these teeny tiny little zooids, this is the ghost moss animal. It's closely related to Hydra. You see these little stinging tentacles there, and they just have a really weird life cycle. I've found them twice in my life, close together, two separate pools close together, but basically nobody knows anything about them or where they exist. But I know two places. Anyway, it was just weird. And gratuitous, nice photo. But you know, it's cool. This horseshoe-shaped lophophore, all these stinging tentacles, you disturb them and they kind of, you know, sort of shrink back into themselves and turn into just muck. But it's pretty cool stuff. There are caddisflies that create cases out of materials that they find in their vernal pool. This one happened to be living in a cranberry bog, so it made its case out of cranberry leaves. That gives them some physical protection, camouflage. They will eat salamander eggs. This is the more common vernal pool variety, log cabin caddisfly that we see a lot. When caddisflies complete their life cycle, they metamorphose, they climb to the water surface, they fly off as an adult bug, and they leave behind the house that they made. And when we go to a dry pool and we kind of get down on our hands and knees and look around, quite often we'll find caddisfly cases in the shells of clams and snails that live in vernal pools. Again, temporary water, and yet we have these aquatic organisms. How do they get through the dry period? You know, there's lots of different life history strategies. Some of them, like fairy shrimp, leave behind a drought-resistant egg and just croak. Others sort of seal up in a mucus envelope and just wait for water to come back, dig down into the mud a bit, or, you know, all sorts of different strategies for getting through the dry periods. There are all sorts of predators. This is a dragonfly larva. We'll get in Massachusetts, we have over 200 species of dragonfly. A good number of them will use vernal pools to breed. Many more of them will use vernal pools as feeding sites. You know, those mosquitoes that escape the salamanders will get scooped up by dragonflies, so that's pretty cool. This is a predaceous diving beetle larva. It found itself a frog to eat and is nibbling away. But this is, you know, one of the questions you can always put a lot of effort into thinking about is how do all these air-breathing organisms survive? And so with these guys, they have these breathing tubes they stick up at the water surface, and they get their air there, and more predation. This is a giant water bug sucking the juices out of a frog tadpole. Giant water bug is the male wearing the eggs that the female laid on his back, the one place that she knows he's not going to be able to get to them. Yeah, this is a meaty leech. You know, there's a lot of leeches in vernal pools. We quite often we'll come across them. I've never been bitten by one. You know, they don't seem to feed on, the ones that I find don't feed on humans, so that's good to know. You know. And then this is a story you have to share because it is the stuff of horror movies. This is a Gordian worm. Okay, and Gordian worms have a interesting, disgusting life cycle. They, as larvae, they are microscopic. They're tiny, and they live in the leaf litter right at the edge of wetlands and vernal pools and stuff. And so when orthopterans come, grasshoppers and the bugs that are related to grasshoppers, they'll come and they'll get their water at the edge of a vernal pool, and if they happen to ingest the larva of a Gordian worm, the Gordian worm begins to grow. and the Gordian worm consumes some of the bug, and it grows a little more, consumes some of the bug, and grows a little more. And ultimately, the worm will be large enough that it entirely fills the body cavity of that bug, even though it's still alive. And so it triggers something in the bug's little brain and says, hey, you're thirsty. The bug goes to a water body, and the worm comes out and completes its life cycle, looks for other worms to make new worms. It doesn't work out so well for the bug. But anyway, there's lots of neat stuff going on in vernal pools. And that's why we love them. There's so many neat stories to learn about, so much interesting natural history to experience. And frankly, it's something that kids, we have found over the years, just absolutely are attracted to. And we find that vernal pools are just fantastic tools for teaching even the youngest of kids some pretty complex natural history and ecological stories. And so the Vernal Pool Association has worked for a long time to make vernal pools something that a lot of people are using in classrooms and so forth. And we put out a lot of materials to try to get teachers using vernal pools in their classroom and bringing kids, giving people an opportunity to go out to something that's, a kid can get their mind around a vernal pool, whereas sometimes a river going by or the ocean, you take someone to those places and it's hard to sort of adopt that and really connect to it. But vernal pools are nice and small. You can see the whole thing. You can spend a lot of time digging around, looking for stuff, and really connect to it. So it's a neat way to connect people of all ages, really, to some pretty neat natural history stories.
Well, because we're at lunchtime, we can take questions.
I just wanted to start by saying that I thought that was a very excellent presentation, very informative. I would never guess that vernal pools could support such a diverse and complex ecosystem such as that. It's amazing. That being said, now you mentioned that some certain vernal pools will retain water almost permanently, almost year-round. Could these permanent vernal pools support any population of fish if introduced, and more so, could those fish have any severe impact on the existing ecosystem of that pool?
Yes, and yes. And we have examples of this. There's a pool in the town where I grew up, and Leo taught, where we'd go there all the time. It was really big and basically permanent. And at some point, kids had thrown hornpouts in, and hornpouts were there for a decade. And the salamanders would come. They'd deposit their eggs. Some would make it out because the population persisted, but for the most part, the salamander population was pretty heavily depressed by the presence of those fish. It finally dried out in one real dry year, and the next year it just exploded with salamanders. So the fish were there, and as long as it didn't dry out, they persisted, and they had a heavy impact on the amphibian populations, but as soon as they got wiped out, it sort of rebounded. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Just a quick question. Now, would you consider highway sumps, the drainage sumps, to be kind of like a man-made vernal, or not really?
So, highway sumps, what we see is a lot of times we'll see retention basins and detention basins that hold water for a period of time can work okay, can actually, as long as they're not maintained properly, they'll quite often work. And that sort of seems to be the state of, yeah. Not to be mean to highway personnel if anybody's here, but yeah, so they can be. But what happens quite often is they will fill in the springtime, with the heavy spring rains, they'll be an attractive nuisance. They'll attract amphibians who will lay their eggs there, and then either because they're maintained properly or eventually they'll dry out too quickly. And so they can operate as population sinks quite often. So we do see that. Highway catch basins are far worse. One of the ways that we do research on amphibians is to set up a drift fence in the forest where we think salamanders and frogs are going, and we'll dig. We'll put 5-gallon buckets in the ground, right at the surface of the ground. And so they hit the drift fence, they walk left or right, and then they'll fall into a bucket and wait there till the morning for us to come and count them. Catch basins work exactly the same way. So we set up a 6 or 8 inch granite curb, salamander hits it, walks, falls in a bucket that nobody comes to check. So that's a real problem. That's from a management standpoint, that's something we deal with a lot. And there's no real good solution. There are some things we can do, but yeah, so highways are problems. All right.